Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your flipped classroom, and we're going to continue our discussion that we left off with yesterday, right? Talking about the medieval Catholic Church, right? Very good job yesterday. I'm crazy impressed by all the hard work that y'all are doing. You're putting in a lot of effort. Y'all are really keeping up with the pace. Y'all are crushing the game. I'm proud to see y'all every day, right? Now, getting into it, though, so I'm pledging to keep this bad boy 15 minutes or under. Right? Well, let's jump right into where we left off in class. We're talking about the things that we probably already know about the medieval Catholic Church, right? Where it was really pretty prevalent to me that like a lot of y'all know a lot of things about the medieval Catholic Church because there's certain things about the medieval Catholic Church that are shared with the modern day Catholic Church, right? So when we're looking at it like the Pope still led the medieval Catholic Church, cardinals, bishops, priests, and stuff like that still led churches and were a part of the infrastructure that was very prevalent during the Middle Ages in Western Europe. They also talked heavily about saints. Saints are going to be a very big thing. You're going to even see saints pop up during the Middle Ages, right? And exist and then be later canonized, right? Like one, for example, St. Joan of Arc, who's actually going to be alive during the 1400s, is going to be canonized as the patron saint of France and is also the patron saint of New Orleans, right? Now, getting into it, though, in general, we also know that they went to church every single day, sometimes 2 to 3 times a day, right? Now, that's very important that you understand that Christians did this, not to be getting that confused with Muslims that we're going to be discussing and doing an analysis about in one of our future classes, right? Now, getting into it, though, as well, something you also need to understand is that the language that the Bible was written in, right? The language was written in Latin, okay? Like, so the Bible was only written in Latin during the time, which is going to set up a very large division of power as well amongst the intelligent masses of the entirety, the intelligent masses of Europe during the time, right? So if you were intelligent enough to know how to read and write, you probably knew how to read and write Latin, so the smartest people in the entirety of the continent worked where? Where else but the church, right? Very good job, Elena. I heard you over there. It's always, I know Alessandra also is killing it right now, so keep up the good work, kid. Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is we got to talk about how did the church affect the daily lives of regular people during the Middle Ages, right? The Middle Ages was already a really rough life, right? We talked about John, right? Audrey's John, right? That's going to have a real rough life because it's a little rough when you look like that, right? But the village church is going to affect John on a very big day-to-day level, right? The village church is what you interacted with. It's where you went to pray 2 to 3 times a day, and it was on your manor, right? Your manor system manor, that big feudalism growth concept where we're talking about how we're splitting up the entirety of that manor and that fiefdom plot of land, and we have like a castle or a manor on a hill, and then that church right there. You went to this bad boy every single day, right? Every single day, because you had so many people that lived on this fief, right? And this right here is actually one of them that has been preserved, and that one's actually on the border of England and Scotland, right? And that church has been there for over 1,000 years, right? Which is absolutely bananas. All right, so now looking at it, though, you have to understand it was all ran by a parish priest, right? So that is the lowest rung of your clergy during this time period, during the medieval Catholic period, right? Or not during the medieval Catholic period, but in the medieval Catholic Church, the lowest person on the rung was the parish priest, right? He's the guy that served you Mass. He did your confessions and stuff like that. And he ran most of the traditional things, services, as well as holidays that actually went down on the manor and at the fiefdom itself. So looking at it, you have to understand it's massively important, okay? The feudal church and the village church is very important to the people of Europe during this time period because it's where you went to receive not one thing, not 2 things, but all the things you needed for salvation, right? You went to your village church to receive your what? Your sacraments, right? Your big sacraments, okay? And I don't know, but I'm pretty confident. Y'all have 7, right? Like 7 sacraments, okay? I teach at a Catholic school, but I am not Catholic. So it's important to understand that Mr. Terry sometimes needs to be taught things by y'all. So we'll talk more about those things when you actually come back into class, right? But I do know some big ones. I know marriage, right, is a big one. I know baptism is a big one. Your burial and your confession, which all had to take place inside of the village church. So you could say that the village church or the manor church is a very important location and place to most people during the medieval time period, right? Now, speaking of being a very important place, if you didn't check off all these things, you were not going to receive salvation. You were not going to go to heaven. You're not actually going to receive the reward that you lived through the Middle Ages and struggled through your entire life to actually get to, right? So it's very important to understand receiving those sacraments went down to that church, right? Now, speaking of the sacraments, one of the most important sacraments you had to receive was the host, right? Receiving the host or the Eucharist and stuff like that. And it was during this time period that the Catholics were going to also adopt a very important tradition, which is this concept called transubstantiation, right? Something very prevalent in the Catholic masses as well as in Catholic churches during the medieval time period or during the medieval era is the fact that the host not only stayed as bread, it was not merely a symbol of Christ, it was Christ himself. Transubstantiation is an adopted belief during the medieval Catholic Church where the piece of bread itself and the wine of that actually like you took when you took your host and like took your what's the thing I'm looking for? Communion, right? There you go. At Mass and stuff like that, is it actually turned into the physical body and blood of Christ, right? Which is still believed by modern-day Catholics as well. But that transubstantiation argument is very important because that was, as it was established as a foundational idea of the entire church and the faith, it's going to become very prevalent later on when we get into the Renaissance and especially during the Reformation, right? Because Martin Luther didn't agree with this, right? So now going into it, though, something else you need to understand is paying the tithe, right? You paid a tax to the church every single Sunday. And it was 10% of your monthly income, right? Now, apparently the word on the street is y'all are not taught how to do percentages anymore, which is really, really sad. But 10% of your weekly income would go to the church in a mandated tax, right? Known as the tithe. Now, the thing about it is if you made $100 a week, then you would give $10 every single Sunday to the church so the church could stay open, run, pay its priests, and keep the buildings in order and in check, right? Now, looking at this, though, is we're now entering the High Middle Ages, y'all. Trade is expanding. People are making more money. So that means their tithes are going up because it's not a flat rate. It's a percentage, which means that the church is going to start making a lot of money during the High Middle Ages, okay? But we'll come back around to that stuff in a little bit, but highlight tithe. Make it look like it's exploding. Circle it, underline it, arrows to it, and stuff like that because we're going to talk about that bad boy for the next like 3 or 4 units, right? The tithe will come up repeatedly, okay? Now, getting into it, though, as well, you not only went to church to receive Christ, but apparently in the medieval Catholic Church and your village church, it's where justice was doled out, right? Trials by God, okay? So the big thing about it that you have to understand is if you committed a crime or did a thing that was big enough to actually violate laws within the village, your justice was not doled out by a judge and a jury of your peers. Your justice was doled out by your priest and a panel of clergy, right? And so these are known usually as ordeals, right? So there are very famous ordeals that would actually go down on medieval like churches and medieval villages and stuff, and they include things like ordeals or trials by fire, an ordeal by fire, or an ordeal by water, right? A good example would be for example, there was a guy named Peter Bartholomew or something like that during the Middle Ages who claimed that he had found during the Crusades the holy lance that actually pierced the side of Christ, right? And he actually was forced to go through an ordeal, right? And the ordeal was they took plow blades and heated them up red hot, and he had to walk over them in bare feet, right? And he actually died of his injuries. And so they would actually look upon him and be like, this lance is not the lance that pierced the side of Christ. He is a liar because he killed him, and God has taken his soul for retribution and judgment, right? But if you actually didn't have any injury, it means that you were innocent. Now, some of you are like, but wait a second, Mr. Terry, you're going to get injured. That is true. If your injuries healed naturally, then you were innocent as well, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that's kind of a dangerous concept that we're just burning people's feet off and stuff like that. But we'll get to that a little bit more later on, right? Now, the other big thing that you have to understand is we just started very, very small. We talked about the village church. Now let's talk about the big churches, the churches that are in the medieval cities during this time period. Within the cities of Paris and London and everywhere else all over Europe, they had massive things, not known as churches, but known as cathedrals. Cathedrals that were ran by bishops and had very large masses every single Sunday, right? Now, the biggest thing you need to understand about these cathedrals is the architectural stylings that they were then created in, okay? So during the early Middle Ages, they actually were done in a very specific type of, oh, that's different. That's Judith beheading Holofernes. Look at that guy, man. He's like really, really intensely like upset about the fact that his head's getting cut off. Now, looking at it though, okay, this was the earliest style of architecture during the Middle Ages, right? And it's known as Romanesque architecture, okay? So that right there is Romanesque, okay? Romanesque means it's kind of like of Rome. It's got some archways and stuff like that. But it's a little bit simple, a little bit kind of orderly, a little bit more like Roman buildings and stuff like that. That right there is how most churches started out during the early Middle Ages. But by the High Middle Ages, a new architectural style is beginning to grow within the medieval Europe, right? And it's known as Gothic architecture, okay? So let's do a thing real quick. We're going to talk about cathedrals and how big they are and stuff, but the main thing we're focusing on right now is aspects of Gothic architecture, right? Cathedrals were primarily built in Gothic architecture during the High Middle Ages and going forward. And remember, we were leaving the early Middle Ages behind us right now. So in the High Middle Ages, Gothic architecture is very important because it demonstrated the wealth of the church. It also demonstrated the growth of intelligence that was mainly happening in the church, right? Now, looking at it, though, the most famous piece of Gothic architecture that you've probably ever seen is, of course, none other than Notre Dame, right? Notre Dame, the very famous Gothic cathedral that started construction in 1100 AD. It's also apparently home to Quasimodo and the Hunchback of Notre Dame and stuff like that, which is like the saddest Disney movie of all time. But looking at it, though, very good example of Gothic architecture, right? Due to the fact that it shares a lot of important elements of it. Now, in that general vein of thinking, make a bullet-pointed list of 4 things and write down any 4 things that I'm going to say that kind of help you signify that's a Gothic church right there whenever you see one, okay? So speaking of, first and foremost, everything comes to a wow, that's way too hard of a zoom. To a point, right? Everything comes to a very sharp, angular point. Lots of spires, lots of very intense angles and pointed ceilings and roofs, right? That's a very big element of Gothic architecture. Another really big element of Gothic architecture includes the windows that are on the outside of it. This right here is St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, Austria, and this is me and my wife when we went to go and visit it and see it, and it's absolutely beautiful. But it also shares a very good emblem of Gothic architecture. See that pointed spire right there? Very Gothic. But what about this little guy, that dome? That's Renaissance architecture. Funny enough, that actually came much later. So you can see in this one building the difference in architecture throughout the hundreds and centuries of years, right? But another big aspect of Gothic architecture includes these guys. Stained glass windows, right? Very, very important. And also, universal stone construction. One type of stone that's used to make the entire thing. Makes it look very, very dark, right? But stained glass windows provided a ton of natural light, right? Now, as you can see as well, this is the other side of St. Stephen's Cathedral. Very, very pointy, very Gothic, very intense. Very large, also vaulted ceilings, okay? When we're looking at it as well, another big element of Gothic architecture are actually these things. Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Oh, no, that goes. So, like, these things right there. Go right there. Rose windows. Round stained glass windows were another high element of Gothic architecture. And another thing about it, too, is these large vaulted ceilings that go way high up. But really quickly, during the medieval era, how would they hold them up? Well, they held them up with these guys. These outside rafters, okay, which you can actually see much better in Notre Dame right here. These things are very, very important, and they gave the structure the ability to have a very high-pitched roof. And what it's known as is a flying buttress. F-L-Y-I-N-G is in flying. And buttress, spelled B-U-T-T-R-E-S-S-E-S, okay? Flying buttresses held the roof up and gave the church an appearance of very high vaulted ceilings, right? Very, very good job. And also, last but not least, you gotta love your gargoyles, right? Your gargoyles are also very, very large elements of Gothic architecture, right? Now, getting into it, though, as well, because they're used to scare off evil spirits. Now, also, though, what about the church and society? How's the church dealing with women, right? So yeah, now the big thing about the views of women in church society during the Middle Ages is that women were seen as equal before the eyes of God in church society, right? However, they were also viewed a lot like Eve, right, in the Bible. Viewed as weak and easily led to sin. And they were taught to try and emblicize the ideas, embody the practices of Mary through practice and prayer, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that this is going to lead to a lot of kind of dysfunctional aspects of medieval society, including things, for example, dowries, the suppressed role of women in society, and also arranged marriages by parents. During the medieval period, you did not choose who you married. You still had an arranged marriage by your father. 9 times out of 10, you were married off to someone much, much older than you, and your dad had to pay a dowry for them to take care of you because now they were your caretaker because you were so weak and easily led to sin. That's sexist and very not feminist-like, and I'm just throwing that out there. It's pretty beat up. And also, another big thing about it is we'll talk about a little bit later on is the veiling of women and stuff like that. We'll talk about that practice a little bit when we actually get into class. But what also about the views of other faiths, right? Well, the church and society, as we saw with Charles Martel, the hammer in the Battle of Tours, hammering the Muslims back down into Spain, a big thing you need to understand in general is that they did not have very tolerant views of other faiths, right? Jewish communities thrived in southern Spain, but anti-Semitism really increased increased in about 1000 AD. Anti-Semitism is the kind of like organized dislike of the Jewish people and faith, right? And so what you're going to see is a pivoting in general during this time period where churches and the Catholic Church begins to kind of not be tolerant of other faiths, right? Leads to very large anti-Semitic activity. Many Jews are going to begin to migrate and leave during another diaspora in Europe and stuff like that. And then later on, when we get to the Crusades, you'll notice how they had a very negative view of Muslims and of Islam as well, right? Now, the other big thing you need to understand, though, is that we're going to see the growth of monasteries and convents, right? So large churches and sanctuaries where monks and nuns would live during this time period and dedicate their life to faith and study and take vows of silence where they would copy books over time and things like that. You have to understand that this is going to lead to what's known as a monastery or a convent, right? And these are places where monks and nuns dedicated their lives to translating original Latin texts of the Bible, literally copying Bibles one at a time, making them very expensive, very arduous, and very, very intensely decorated, right? But the thing about it also is these monasteries and convents did provide things to the community, right? Some healthcare, housing, local areas for travelers. But another thing that you need to understand that's going to come down during this time period is this saint is going to come along, and his name is Saint Benedict, and he is the guy that shows up and establishes rules and regulations for monks and nuns to live their lives by, right? And this is actually during the 6th century AD, but he's going to make some general ones, right? Like monks had to wear their outfit all the time, so they had to be able to jump up and prepare themselves to preach at any moment. They had to actually also sleep with a light on. They couldn't eat animals with cloven hooves. But later on, a few centuries later, a few rules are going to be added to the St. Benedict rules, right? This right here, of course, is St. Benedict showing the rules of monastic life to these monks and nuns. A lot of it, too, was labor or vows of labor, where they would actually keep the monastery clean. Vows of silence was another Benedictine vow as well, where you would actually be quiet for long periods of time. Fasting to try and get closer to Christ. Those are all Benedictine rules. But the three big political ones that were added later on are going to be long after St. Benedict is already dead. And they're going to be the vows of poverty, which means that the church is not there to make money. They're there to actually serve the society. Chastity, which means that they're actually going to be prevented from marrying or actually deviating to lustful or other relationships outside of the church, that they must dedicate themselves to the study and faith of Christ. And another big one is obedience to the church leader and also to Christ himself, which means that whatever the Pope says goes, right? Now, these three are going to be very important because the St. Benedictine rules, which were used to regulate monks and nuns' lives, are going to be heavily violated later on by some corrupt popes and stuff like that, which is going to help lead to the Reformation, which you're learning about right now in Mr. Mathern's class, right? Now, interestingly enough, though, these monks and these monasteries and these convents are going to also house some of the largest libraries that existed inside of Europe and some of the original translations of Latin scholars and of Latin philosophers and ancient Romans as well. So these monasteries, since they house these first libraries, are going to begin to attract the most intelligent people from the continent, right? People that can still read, can still write. And what's going to happen is masters of other fields are going to show up. Other people that are like, I am a master smith. I'm a master this. Are there any books or intelligence that I can learn from this monastery or convent? And as it attracts masters of different academic fields, these monasteries and convents grew into what you know now as universities or colleges, right, and stuff like that. So the very first universities and universities and colleges grew off of monasteries and convents, right? And these, for example, the earliest three are that of Oxford, right? So Paris, and the oldest one in the entirety of Europe, was created in the 1000s. It's the University of Bologna in Italy, right? So looking at that, though, is an idea that was borrowed from the Muslims, right? So the Muslims that actually created universities and libraries and large areas for translating different works and stuff like that in different Muslim and Arabic countries already. The Christians are just going to kind of take that idea and they're going to propagate it as well. But then you have to understand that church power is going to start growing a little too rapidly. The church and the popes are going to begin to accrue massive amounts of wealth, which is going to lead to some corruption. And this corruption is going to lead to extreme concepts of punishment and when people refuse to pay their tribute to the church, right? And we'll talk about those things in class when I'll see y'all next time, okay? Y'all have a good one.